Ownership, when examined closely, is less stable than it appears. It feels absolute, legal, defined. A man acquires land, builds on it, and calls it his. He accumulates assets, stores them, and assumes permanence. The language reinforces the idea: my house, my field, my wealth. But in the older texts, particularly within the Torah, this assumption is quietly unsettled, not challenged directly, reframed. There is a recurring pattern in the structure of biblical law. Commands are given, permissions are granted, systems are described. Yet within those systems, a subtle distinction is maintained, one that is easy to overlook if one reads too quickly: the distinction between possessing something and truly owning it. This becomes clearer when we move into the legal passages concerning land. In the book of Leviticus, there is a statement that interrupts the normal flow of property law. The land shall not be sold permanently, for the land is mine, for you are strangers and sojourners with me. It is an unusual insertion, because up to that point, the text has been describing how land is divided, inherited, transferred, the mechanics of ownership, the structure of possession, and then, without changing the system, it introduces a limitation. The land is mine. This does not abolish ownership in the practical sense. Families still receive land. They cultivate it. They pass it to their children. They manage it as though it belongs to them. But the text introduces a second layer, a deeper claim, one that exists above the legal structure. From a modern perspective, this seems symbolic, a theological statement inserted into an otherwise economic system. But within the Jewish tradition, it functions differently. It is not symbolic. It is structural. Because once this premise is accepted, the nature of ownership changes. A man may hold property, he may control it, he may benefit from it, but he does not possess it in the absolute sense. He is not the final authority over it. He is, instead, a steward. The distinction is subtle, but its implications are extensive. To understand this, we need to step back into the historical context. Ancient Near Eastern societies were built on clear hierarchies of ownership. Kings owned land, subjects worked it. Wealth flowed upward, control and ownership were aligned. The one who controlled the resource was understood to own it completely. There was no separation. The Torah disrupts this alignment. It allows for control, but it limits ownership. Consider the structure of the Jubilee year. Every 50 years, land that had been sold returns to its original family. Transactions are effectively reversed. The buyer, who may have held the land for decades, must release it. Not because of failure, not because of debt, but because the system requires it. From a purely economic standpoint, this is inefficient. It disrupts long-term accumulation. It prevents permanent consolidation of land. It introduces instability into the market, or at least it appears to. But the underlying logic is different. The land was never fully owned by the buyer, only controlled, leased in effect within a fixed time frame. The Jubilee reveals this reality. What appears permanent is, in fact, temporary. This is not limited to land. The same pattern appears in other areas. Tithes, first fruits, sabbatical years. Each introduces a moment where control is interrupted, where the individual must release something they possess, not because they lack it, but because they are not its ultimate owner. At this point, the modern reader often reduces the idea to obligation, a requirement imposed by religious law. Give this portion, release that asset, observe this cycle. But this interpretation misses the deeper structure, because the system is not merely extracting resources, it is training perception. If a man believes he owns something absolutely, his behavior follows a predictable pattern. He seeks to maximize extraction, to increase yield without limitation, and to secure, defend, and expand. The asset becomes an extension of the self. Its loss is personal, its growth is identity. But if he understands that his role is temporary, that control is granted, not inherent. His behavior changes. He becomes more cautious, not in a fearful sense, but in a measured one. He considers long-term consequences, not because he will own the outcome forever, but because he is accountable for how he manages what is entrusted to him. This introduces a different kind of discipline, one that does not rely on external enforcement, but on internal framing. There is a passage in Deuteronomy that reinforces this. Lest you say in your heart, "My power and the might of my hand have gotten me this wealth." The warning is precise. It does not deny effort. It does not suggest that wealth appears without labor, but it challenges the conclusion that effort equals ownership. This is where the psychological dimension begins to emerge, because the belief in absolute ownership creates a particular mindset. It narrows perspective. It focuses attention on immediate gain. It reduces the importance of preservation, continuity, and transfer. In contrast, the stewardship model expands perspective. The individual sees himself within a chain, receiving, managing, and eventually passing forward. The asset is not an endpoint, it is a responsibility. This has direct economic implications, though they are rarely stated explicitly. A steward does not deplete a resource carelessly, because its value extends beyond his period of control. He maintains it, improves it when possible, and avoids decisions that produce short-term gain at long-term cost. An owner, in the absolute sense, has no such constraint. If the asset is truly his, permanently, then maximizing present value becomes rational. Future consequences are secondary. The Torah's framework subtly discourages this, not through prohibition, but through structure. By ensuring that control is always temporary, that ownership is never final. This is also visible in the laws concerning debt. In the sabbatical year, debts are released, not renegotiated, not extended. Released. Again, this appears economically disruptive. Credit systems rely on enforcement, on continuity, on the expectation that obligations will persist until fulfilled. But the Torah introduces interruption, a reset, not to eliminate lending, but to prevent its transformation into permanent domination. The creditor controls the debt, but does not own the debtor. The distinction is maintained. Over time, these patterns create a particular type of economic environment, one where accumulation is possible, but not absolute, where control is real, but limited, where wealth can grow, but must be handled with restraint. This produces stability, not through restriction of activity, but through limitation of assumption. The modern misunderstanding arises when ownership is treated as total, as if legal possession equals ultimate authority, as if control, once established, can extend indefinitely without consequence. This assumption leads to a specific set of behaviors: over-leverage, over-expansion, short-term optimization, neglect of underlying structure, and eventually instability. The Torah anticipates this, not by prohibiting wealth, but by redefining the relationship to it. It allows the individual to act, to build, to acquire, to manage. But it places a boundary around his perception. You control this, but you do not own it absolutely. This boundary is not always visible. It does not interfere with daily operations. A man can live his entire life appearing to own everything he touches. But at specific intervals, the system reveals itself. The land returns. The debt is released. The tithe is given. The first fruits are brought. Each moment reinforces the same principle. What you hold is not ultimately yours. Over time, this shapes behavior in ways that are difficult to replicate artificially. And because it is not enforced continuously, it is internalized gradually. There is also a generational effect. If wealth is seen as personal possession, it is often consumed, enjoyed, displayed, sometimes preserved, but without a clear framework for transfer. If it is seen as entrusted, it is structured, organized, prepared for continuity. The difference is not in the amount of wealth, but in its trajectory. The Jewish tradition places significant emphasis on inheritance, on passing assets, knowledge, and responsibility to the next generation. This is not simply cultural, it is consistent with the underlying model. If no individual truly owns the asset in the absolute sense, then each generation becomes a temporary manager, receiving from the previous, preparing for the next. This creates continuity, not just of wealth, but of structure. At this point, the central idea begins to come into focus, though it has been present from the beginning, quietly embedded. The separation of ownership from control is not a limitation, it is a protection. It protects the individual from the illusion of permanence, from the tendency to overextend, from the impulse to extract without regard for consequence. It protects the system from concentration, from stagnation, from collapse driven by unchecked accumulation. And perhaps most importantly, it protects the future by ensuring that what is built is not consumed entirely in the present. This does not eliminate risk, it does not guarantee success, but it introduces a stabilizing force, one that operates beneath the surface. In modern language, and it might be described as a shift from possession to stewardship, but the original framework is more precise. God is the owner, man is the manager. This is not presented as metaphor, but as structure. And within that structure, wealth behaves differently. It is handled with more care, more restraint, more awareness of consequence. Not because of fear, but because of clarity. The man who believes he owns everything will act accordingly. The man who understands that he is entrusted with it will act differently. The Torah does not force the second behavior directly. It creates the conditions under which it becomes natural. And so the system continues, quietly, across generations, not through dramatic intervention, but through a consistent, almost understated principle. You may control what you hold, you may benefit from it, you may build with it, but you do not own it in the way you think, and in that distinction, everything changes.